So the first part of this process was going to be making a paper template, and all the dimensions of this are based off the size of the gong and how far it hangs off of the stand. So I started with a 36-inch circle, and I just put a nail in a piece of wood and measured out 18 inches in order to get that 36 inches off of that center pivot point, and then cut out my circle. By folding this multiple times in half, you can get your easily made cross sections, and then I'll end up putting diagonals on this as well so that that circle's split evenly all the way. And then I knew that these were going to be made in chunks, so I came in, I believe, 4 inches on that compass I made, and then drew another half circle. So the wood I'm going to be using for the main bulk of this arch is walnut. It's a piece of walnut I had left over from the credenza stand, and because this whole piece is being pieced out into smaller sections to make that arch, I also got away with using cutoffs from a lot of my other projects. So to make this walnut go as far as possible, I ripped it into a 4-inch piece, and then I also had some red oak that I ripped into 4-inch pieces. And then I was going to rip this walnut in half. So I was going to sandwich that oak inside the walnut because I wanted to be able to see the walnut. I like the look of walnut better, but the walnut wasn't thick enough to act as the whole stand. It ended up being a nice design element having that red oak floating inside this walnut as well. So I believe this was about a 60-inch long piece of walnut, which was just enough to get what I needed. So after I ripped it in half, I sandwiched that red oak in between, and I put the rough edges on the outside because I could plane this down once the glue up was over and have a nice smooth surface. So I let that completely set up overnight with just about every C-clamp in my shop. And I started calling this an Oreo because it looks like an Oreo. And then I hand planed all of that glue off, as well as flatten that top surface a little bit because it was the glue up always moves around a little bit, so it wasn't perfectly flat. And then I kind of hand planed off the rough parts on the top and bottom as well, just to kind of even everything up, save some time at the planer. So since I'm going to be putting dovetails in these to connect all of them, it's super important that all of these pieces I'm starting with are as close to exact as possible. So once I kind of took off all those high spots with the hand plane, I sent it through my actual planer, and my planer goes up high enough I was actually able to plane the edges as well. So this piece came out very flat. So then this piece will be chunked out into 4 sections in order to make that arch, so everything will have to be cut on an angle. So once I was done planing, you could see I made a template out of some Luan just to make sure the angle I had was going to get me that arch I needed. I found the angle that I cut on the Luan and transferred that to my table saw with my cross-cutting sled, and I have a little miter gauge in there. In order to make these slide easier, I pre-cut them into their 4 sections, and I believe these ended up being about 15 inches long. So now you have 4-inch wide by 15-inch long, and I think they're almost 3 inches thick. And then I just rough cut the edges with that angle. All 4 pieces, I cut that angle on the one edge first. And I usually keep a nicer blade in my table saw, so this is a cross-cutting blade, so it gives you a nice smooth finish. Once I had the edges cut on one side, I marked where that other side should be, used my template to draw a rough line, and then set up a stop on the other side of my cross-cutting sled so that I could cut the 4 pieces to the exact width and dimension with that stop in place. So after cutting these, I put them on my paper template and make sure I'm at 36 inches. Now I was kind of stuck with the measurements I had for this because, like I said, I was using up that piece of walnut. So when I put the dovetails in here, I actually lose 1.5 inches on all of my pieces, which makes this a little bit smaller than 36 inches. So if you're making something like this, kind of think beforehand about losing the length of the piece that is going to be going into the wood. So I'm cutting dovetails in these. These are just rough dovetails. They don't have to be super accurate like you do for drawers. So I did, I think it was a 12-degree tilt on my blade, and then these are 1.5 inches long, and I just came in enough to make the visual look good on the red oak. So the end of that dovetail there kind of just hits the red oak, and I used a jig I have for cutting tenons that's kind of rides on my table saw fence, and I just sliced all of those dovetails. Now I didn't want to change the degree on my table saw for when I cut the other part of the dovetail, so I kind of set up this little system on my radial arm saw in order to remove that waist shoulder. So I raised the blade on my radial arm saw, and like you could see, I set up, I actually used my template to set up and get that straight edge and cut that waist off. In order to do it on both sides, I had to then switch the template and the stop to the other side, and this actually worked pretty well. I thought I was going to have to rough cut this and then clean it up, but that cut ended up actually being pretty nice. So since this is just a single dovetail, I don't actually have to cut pins. They're kind of made by cutting the tail, so I just use the tail as reference onto the other pieces of lumber. The tails are all on one side, and then I'll be cutting sockets on the other. So I just transferred all of those measurements from the actual tail on there and lined everything up with my blade, which I haven't moved since I cut the tails, and I was able to then cut all of the sockets. Same way, measuring off one edge. If your measurements are correct and you like I'm doing, I flip these, it cuts it perfectly symmetrical. And then what I did was I just kind of cut all of the socket marks, and then you'll see I end up just moving the piece along the blade and kind of curve cutting out the waist. So I just keep sliding my fence and curve cutting out that waist. Once I get to the other edge, I'll have to flip it to finish it up, but this really quickly removed all of that waste. It gave me a nice, pretty flat bottom, and I just was able to clean up the rest with a chisel. And then once I had all my pieces, I kind of cleared out that waste, just roughly cleared it up and test fit them all together, and I was pretty happy with the fit. They were tight without being too loose, and they just about fit perfectly on all of them. So after this, I kind of put the arch to the side for a little bit and started work on the base, and the base once again was based off measurements I had. This is the leftover piece of that ripped piece of walnut, so it only ended up being about 5 inches tall by 12 inches wide, and if I could go back in time, I would have made this base a little bit bigger. At the time I wished it was bigger, but I kind of went with it anyway, but that would have helped out in a couple of aspects down the road, and ended up not ruining the piece, but I do wish it was a little bigger. So in order to match the arc, I cut that walnut into 4 sections in order to get the height, and then cut them in half as well, and then I nestled some red oak on either edge. So this base is going to have some weight inside of it in order to hold up the cantilevered action of that arch. So what I did was I made this big box, and then I only put that red oak around the edges. So I started to create a recess on the inside. So to make that recess more prominent, I went through with my crosscut sled, raised up, and I cut a very long dado along this edge. There's faster ways to do this, but this goes by fairly quickly. So with all those curve cuts, I can then clean out the excess, and then you'll see I'll have a rather large void in that piece now. So I just glued up those 4 chunks with that red oak on top, the red oak on the sides, making sure everything was flush, and then my walnut on top as well. And you can see now I have a rather large void where I could put weight inside of it to help counteract all of the weight coming off that one arm of the arch. And I let this sit up overnight as well. So the end of my arch ends on, one side ends on a socket and one side ends on a tail. So the tail end I'm going to be putting into the box. So I had to clean up the box and get it pretty square in order to cut that socket into it. So I just went to the radial arm saw and I roughly cut off all the excess, and then once again my planer went up high enough that I was actually able to send this through. I had to hold it pretty close to the edge and pretty far underneath the piece so that it, to avoid kip. It might look a little scary in the video because your hands are going underneath where they tell you not to put your hands underneath, but the blade is so far up from where I'm pushing it, it wasn't an issue, and by holding it down I was able to get a really nice flat surface on all sides of my piece. And then once I had that box, I did the exact same process I did for the arch. I took my previous cut tail, transfer it onto that box, and then I had adjusted my table saw since last I cut the dovetails, so I just used one of the pieces that isn't glued up yet to realign that blade. It was about, like I said, a 12-degree tilt, and it was about 1.5 inches raised up, and then I used the same process in order to cut that socket. Someone actually gave me a really nice Delta tenoning jig, which I haven't used yet, and I did not want to practice using it on this. So you can get away with using, this is a shop-made jig that's helping me cut all these dovetails, and then cleaning up the waste with a sharp chisel. And then the next couple bits are just test fitting all of the pieces, which was, I'm not gonna lie, a little nerve-wracking because, like I said, this was the only lumber I had. I could go buy more walnut, but it is gonna, the finish will come out nicest if you're using similar pieces because they'll finish similarly. So this is where this thing started to be a headache, because until I add the proper counterweights in order to counteract that arch, it always had to be either clamped to my workbench or weighted. I ended up using a 10-pound dumbbell and a 10-pound kettlebell to kind of help with holding it upright so I could work on it. So before it came time to glue up everything, I went through and cleaned up all of my dovetails nicely with a chisel and a file, just because that table saw will leave little arches on all of your pieces, and then once everything fit, I could attach them. So I'm going to be attaching these with not only glue but also some dowels, and I'm going to draw bore the dowels in order to pull the pieces tight when doing that. So I drilled holes through the socket side of all of my pieces. I made a mark with the drill bit, and then I just moved that mark over about 1/16 of an inch from the mark of the original holes. So that means when I go to put dowels in here, it's going to pull the piece together because those holes are minorly offset. Now you can't get crazy with this. If you drill your hole too far offset, it will break the joint. But I could not think of a clever way to glue this. I didn't really want to clamp it. I didn't want to spend a ton of time thinking of it. So the fit of these dovetails was already nice and tight, and with doing those drawboard holes, everything pulled together nicely. There was only minor gaps in the pieces, and most of those gaps actually disappeared when I routed out the art. And then that is where this video is going to end, with the glued up arch. I don't actually glue this into the base until a little ways into the next video, just because I start forming the arch and the base as well. So the next video is going to be just about finishing up the rest of the structure, and the third video is going to be finishing as well as final touches. So I rewatched this before I was about to publish it, and an interesting fact of this build was the original design was going to have legs on the base, and it wasn't until I started building it where I kind of came up with this ideal to have a streamlined piece with no legs and a weighted base. So this was definitely kind of exploring my lack of knowledge in physics, trying to figure out how to make this